In the last 24 hours, details have fully emerged about one of the most strategically consequential defense procurement decisions made by any NATO ally in recent memory. Canada, America's closest military partner, the other half of the only binational air defense command on the planet, walked into a Swedish boardroom, signed a deal worth over $1 billion, and walked out holding aircraft that defense analysts are now openly saying could leave the Arctic blind. Not partially blind, not temporarily blind. Structurally, systematically blind, with gaps baked directly into the hardware. This changes everything, not just for Canada, not just for NORAD, for the entire architecture of Western air defense in the high north. This is Arctic Command Decoded, where power shifts in the world's most dangerous airspace are broken down in real time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this now, because what we're about to lay out is something even most defense professionals haven't fully processed yet. Let's be precise about what just happened, because precision matters here. Canada selected Saab's GlobalEye aircraft, a Swedish early warning surveillance platform, over Boeing's competing model. On the surface, that sounds like a routine procurement choice. One plane versus another, a different manufacturer, a different price point. Governments make these calls all the time, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is that this decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of a full-scale tariff war between Canada and the United States. It happened as the relationship between Ottawa and Washington has grown more strained than at any point in modern history. It happened as Canada publicly positioned itself as an independent actor, no longer willing to simply align with American industrial interests by default. And it happened with a specific aircraft that, according to defense specialists who have studied the platform in detail, carries a capability gap so significant that it calls into question the entire rationale for the purchase. Here's what the Saab GlobalEye actually is. It is an airborne early warning and control system, an AEW&C platform, built on the Bombardier Global 6000 business jet airframe and fitted with Saab's own Interoperability radar system. It is, by most civilian aviation standards, an impressive piece of engineering. Saab has sold it to the United Arab Emirates. Sweden operates a variant of the underlying technology. On paper, it performs surveillance, maritime patrol, and limited battle management functions. It is not a bad aircraft, but here's where everything starts to break down. The Interoperability radar system is what's called a side-looking radar. It radiates outward from both sides of the fuselage in a wide swath. But it cannot see directly in front of the aircraft. It cannot see directly behind it. And depending on how the aircraft is positioned, it leaves significant angular gaps in coverage. Military analysts describe this plainly. The GlobalEye does not have a 360-degree radar aperture. Canada just bought an early warning aircraft that cannot warn about a large portion of the sky around it. Now let's talk about where Canada needs to use this aircraft. Not over the English Channel, not over the Mediterranean, over the Arctic, over the most vast, the most unforgiving, the most strategically contested airspace in the world. An airspace where the flight paths of Russian bombers and ballistic missiles converge in narrow corridors, corridors that require precise, continuous, 360-degree situational awareness to track reliably. This isn't theoretical. The Arctic is the primary threat vector for any future Russian air or missile strike against North America. That has been the foundational assumption of Canadian and American air defense planning for over 7 decades. And this is where things get worse. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, is not just an organization. It is a system, a deeply integrated, technically sophisticated, continuously evolving system of sensors, communications networks, data links, and decision protocols that spans the entire continent. The aircraft that feed into NORAD don't just fly around and look at things. They communicate. They transmit encrypted data in standardized formats. They synchronize with ground stations, with satellites, with naval assets, and with allied platforms in real time. Every component of that system uses shared protocols, shared security architectures, shared data encryption standards. It is one of the most tightly integrated defense networks ever built. The Saab GlobalEye was not designed to plug into that network. And that is not a minor technical footnote. That is the entire story. Intelligence reports from defense specialists cited in Canadian policy analysis suggest that the GlobalEye lacks the specific secure data link architecture that NORAD's integrated air picture relies upon. It was built for different customers, different missions, different operational environments. The UAE doesn't need to feed real-time data into a shared North American defense network. Sweden doesn't need seamless interoperability with American battle management systems over Baffin Island. Canada does. That is literally Canada's job inside NORAD. And the aircraft Canada just purchased may not be able to do it. Military analysts are already warning that this creates something unprecedented, a structural seam in NORAD's coverage, not a temporary gap caused by weather or maintenance cycles, a permanent hardware-level gap in the northern radar picture, built into the system by design, by procurement choice, by politics. But that's not the real problem either, because what makes this situation genuinely dangerous isn't just the technology, it's the timing. Consider the strategic environment in which this decision was made. Russia has spent the last several years aggressively expanding its Arctic military infrastructure, new air bases above the Arctic Circle, new radar installations on islands across the Siberian North. New variants of long-range cruise missiles specifically designed to fly low, fast, and through radar gaps. Russia's military planners are not operating under the assumption that NORAD is invincible. They are actively looking for seams. They are actively probing response times. They are actively mapping the exact contours of Western air defense coverage in the high north. And Canada just handed them a map with a new gap drawn on it. Defense experts understand what this means operationally. When an early warning system has a coverage gap, adversaries can plan ingress routes that exploit it. They don't need to defeat your radar. They just need to find the angle where your radar isn't looking. And if that angle exists because of a hardware limitation baked into your new aircraft, one that your adversary's intelligence services can study by examining the publicly known specifications of the Saab GlobalEye, then your early warning system has a problem that no amount of software updates can fully resolve. Let's talk about the 80-year relationship that is now under strain. NORAD was established in 1958. For the entirety of the Cold War, it was the backbone of North American continental defense. The premise was simple and absolute. Canada and the United States would defend the northern approaches together as one integrated command with shared assets, shared intelligence, and shared decision-making. That arrangement survived every political disagreement between Ottawa and Washington. It survived the Vietnam War when Canada publicly criticized American policy. It survived trade disputes, cultural tensions, and decades of debates about defense spending. The NORAD partnership was treated as untouchable because both countries understood that if the Arctic fell off the radar, both countries paid the price. That implicit agreement is now being tested in a way it has never been tested before. The reality is that this procurement decision is inseparable from the political context in which it was made. Canada's current government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, came to power in a moment of acute friction with the United States. American tariffs on Canadian goods, rhetoric about Canadian sovereignty, and public pressure from Washington to align more closely with American economic and industrial preferences. All of it created a political environment in Ottawa where being seen to buy American was politically toxic. The Boeing aircraft Canada passed over is an American product. Choosing it would have meant sending hundreds of millions of dollars to an American manufacturer at the exact moment when Canadian political messaging was built around economic independence from the United States. So Canada chose Sweden, and that choice changes everything, because now the operational consequences of political messaging have to be lived with for the next 30 years. Because that is the other thing about defense procurement that is easy to forget. When a country buys a major military platform, they are not making a decision for the next election cycle. They are making a decision for the next 3 decades. The aircraft Canada just selected will be the primary airborne surveillance platform for the Royal Canadian Air Force's surveillance mission through the 2032, the 2042, and potentially into the 2052. The integration challenges, the capability gaps, the interoperability limitations, all of those problems will compound over time, not diminish. Every upgrade cycle, every new NORAD data standard, every new American early warning protocol will have to be negotiated around the limitations of an aircraft that wasn't designed to be part of the system in the first place. And this is where things get worse again, because Canada isn't just buying an aircraft. Canada is sending a signal, and signals in the defense world have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate transaction. Washington's defense establishment has watched this procurement decision with deep concern, not because the United States is simply upset about losing a contract, though the Boeing lobbying ecosystem in Washington certainly has opinions. The deeper concern is structural. If Canada, the most closely integrated military ally the United States has, the other half of the only truly joint North American command, is willing to procure a primary surveillance platform outside the American defense industrial base, outside the established NORAD interoperability frameworks, in the middle of a geopolitical dispute, what does that mean for the future of the alliance? What does it tell Russia about the coherence of Western air defense? What does it tell other NATO allies about the durability of American alliance commitments in the high north? Intelligence reports suggest that the ripple effects of this decision are being studied carefully in Moscow, not because Russia is celebrating. Russian strategic planners are too sophisticated to assume that NORAD has simply collapsed overnight, but because this decision confirms something that Russian strategic doctrine has long theorized, that the political bonds of the Western alliance are a more exploitable vulnerability than the military hardware itself. If you can drive a wedge between Canada and the United States, not through military force, but through economic pressure and political friction, you can degrade the integrated defense picture without firing a single missile. The real strategic threat is not the GlobalEye's radar gap. The real strategic threat is the gap in political trust that made this decision possible. This changes everything, not because NORAD collapses tomorrow, but because the logic that held NORAD together for 80 years, The logic that said alliance integrity is more important than domestic politics has been openly overridden. And once that precedent is set, it doesn't stay confined to Canada. Other NATO allies are watching, countries that have their own reasons to push back against American defense industrial dominance, countries that have their own political pressures to demonstrate strategic autonomy, countries that have watched Canada make this choice and note with great interest that the sky didn't immediately fall. The precedent that Canada has set that a core ally can make a procurement decision that degrades alliance interoperability for domestic political reasons, and that the consequences will be managed quietly. That precedent is dangerous because it suggests that the integrated architecture of Western defense is more negotiable than anyone previously admitted. And Russia has noticed. China has noticed. Every strategic competitor that looks at the Western alliance and asks where the seams are, they have all updated their maps in the last few days. The seam is in the Arctic. The seam runs through the angular blind spot of a Saab GlobalEye radar, flying north of 70 degrees latitude. And the seam was put there not by a missile or a cyber attack. It was put there by a procurement decision made in Ottawa. The truth is that Canada's defense policy has long suffered from the comfortable assumption that geography and alliance membership provide security that doesn't need to be paid for in full. The United States has, for decades, absorbed the cost of Canada's relative underinvestment in its own Arctic defense, because the alternative, a northern neighbor with inadequate air defenses, was worse for American security than simply covering the gap. That implicit arrangement created a kind of strategic moral hazard in Ottawa. The knowledge that whatever Canada did or didn't do, the Americans would be there. NORAD would hold. The Arctic would be covered. The GlobalEye decision is, in a strange way, the full flowering of that moral hazard. Canada has made a procurement choice that serves domestic political needs, knowing at some level that the operational gaps it creates will be absorbed quietly and resentfully by the American side of NORAD. It is a decision that treats the alliance as a resource to be drawn on rather than a structure to be maintained. And that attitude, more than the radar gap itself, is what is genuinely alarming to people who study these institutions, because institutions that are treated as resources eventually run out. Alliances that are treated as guarantees without obligations eventually become guarantees without teeth. Defense experts understand something important about this moment. The next 5 years in the Arctic are going to be among the most consequential in the history of the region. Climate change is opening new shipping routes, new resource extraction opportunities, new military access corridors. Russia is building new Arctic bases faster than at any point since the Cold War. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing in Arctic infrastructure at a rate that even 5 years ago would have seemed implausible. The competition for control of the High North is no longer a future scenario. It is a present reality. Military analysts are already warning that the quiet management option is the more likely path and the more dangerous one, because gaps that are quietly managed are gaps that never get fixed. They become institutional assumptions. They become the new normal. And then one day, in a scenario that no one predicted, in an environment more contested than anyone planned for, the gap is there, visible, exploitable, and too late to close. That is the history of strategic failures. They are rarely sudden. They are almost always the accumulation of decisions that each seemed manageable in isolation, until the moment when they weren't. Canada has an opportunity right now, a narrow one and a politically difficult one, but a real one. The opportunity to demand that Saab and the Canadian government commit to a binding, fully resourced, NORAD certified interoperability upgrade path with hard deadlines, hard technical specifications, and genuine accountability mechanisms. The opportunity to be transparent with the Canadian public about what the GlobalEye can and cannot do, rather than papering over the limitations with reassuring language about future capability enhancements. The opportunity to treat this moment as a warning, a sign that the gap between political decision-making and strategic reality has grown dangerously wide, and to begin the institutional work of closing it. Whether that opportunity is seized is a question that only the Canadian government can answer, but the world and the Arctic is watching. This changes everything, not because one procurement decision destroys an 80-year alliance overnight, but because this decision has made visible what was previously invisible, that the integrated architecture of Western Arctic defense rests on political trust, and that political trust can be eroded by economics, by pride, by the ordinary pressures of democratic governance. And once that erosion becomes visible, it becomes real to allies, to adversaries, and to the institution itself. The Arctic is not a peripheral concern. It is the geographic heart of the most consequential military standoff of the next century. The nations that control awareness in the high north, that can see, track, and respond faster than their adversaries, will shape what happens on the ground, in the water, and in the skies in ways that extend far beyond the Arctic itself. Early warning in the Arctic is not a regional capability. It is a global strategic asset. And Canada has just introduced uncertainty into that asset in a way that will take years to fully understand and potentially decades to fully resolve. 3 questions to leave you with, because these are the questions that will define what comes next. First, will the United States use this moment to fundamentally renegotiate the terms of NORAD, demanding enforceable interoperability standards and minimum capability benchmarks before any ally can claim to fulfill a NORAD mission? Or will Washington absorb the gap and say nothing, trading strategic clarity for political convenience? Second, will Canada's defense establishment, its military leadership, its intelligence community, its defense policy professionals find a way to force a real technical and strategic accounting of what the GlobalEye can and cannot do in the Arctic environment? Or will institutional loyalty to the government's decision override professional judgment about operational risk? And third, what does Russia do with the next 3 to 5 years? The window in which Canada's Arctic surveillance capability is most constrained, most uncertain, most subject to the limitations of an aircraft still being integrated into a network it wasn't designed for? Does Moscow see this as a window of opportunity? And if it does, what does that window look like from the inside of an aircraft flying low over the Beaufort Sea, below the angular threshold of a radar that cannot see the sky in front of it? The Arctic doesn't forgive blind spots, and right now, Canada has one. If this analysis cut through the noise for you, subscribe, share, and leave your read on this below. The conversation happening right now in Ottawa and Washington is one that the public deserves to be part of. Stay sharp.